Carl Finds a Home. A Wilma and Carl story. Written by Havilah McGlatt. Illustrated by Rocco DeCaro. One evening in the forest, there was a black cat passing through. The cat stopped because she was tired and weary. She found a tree with a hoe. She peeked inside and saw it was covered in rusty leaves. After stepping inside, she observed and circled a few times and then lay down to rest. Hours later, the cat was no longer alone. She birthed a litter of newborn kittens. One had a white and black coat. The second, just white. And the last, much like her. She licked them till they were dry and clean. Shortly after that, the mother cat noticed one wasn't crawling like the others. Two crawled and snuggled against her stomach and drank milk. She glanced closely at him. He was shivering, and the mother moved and brought him closer to her and the others. But he wasn't eating. The mother grew worried. She purred and didn't know what to do. She touched his nose, and he didn't look up. She stood up and carried him as any mother cat would do. She feared he was sick and needed help. She ran out to find someone. The mother wandered around and suddenly noticed a glow in the forest. She followed it. When she did, she could see light coming from inside the cottage. Once she approached the door, she gently laid him down and began scratching on the door. At the same time, she cried. Then the door cracked open, and the mother stopped crying and fled. The person who opened the door was a young girl. But she wasn't an ordinary girl, she was a witch. Her parents were visiting a friend in another village. When she glanced around and looked down, she covered her face. She gasped. It was a kitty. She bends down and saw how sick he looked. Her heart ached for this kitty. She picked him up and brought him inside. After tending him with special care, the kitty slowly recovered. Wilma named him Carl. A few days became weeks and turned into months. Carl was no longer a baby. He grew to an average-sized cat. One day, while Wilma was out of town, Carl woke up from his nap and stretched his body. He suddenly saw something creeping across the floor to another room. He jumped from the chair to find it. Walking in the room, he glanced around. This room was the place Wilma did her experiments with magic. Much of her magic was harmless, and she only used them for good purposes. Sometimes he got a little fussy and worried about things she did. When Wilma wasn't around, Carl made sure nobody got into her things. About the same time, he paused. His whiskers winked. His ears perked. He could hear something. Carl spun around and saw a creature with a long tail. It was a nasty rat. He held out his claws and then chased after it. Before he caught him, the ugly rat jumped up onto the table and stood beside the bottles. Carl hissed because those were important to Wilma. They were formulas she created. As soon as Carl took a huge leap, the rat pushed the bottle with his tail. The rat fled before Carl could attack him. Then he heard Wilma calling his name. "Carl, is that you?" Carl jumped off and quickly licked up the mess. When he did that, Wilma entered the room. Carl turned his eyes to her. From the look on her face, he could tell she didn't look happy. Wilma shook her head and frowned. "How many times have I told you not to jump and break things?" she asked. Then, for the first time, he opened his mouth and spoke. "I didn't do it!" Wilma's eyes widened. "Did you speak?" Carl looked puzzled, not realizing at first he could talk. "Did I?" Wilma laughed and said, "I guess one of my formulas gave you the ability to speak." "I didn't mean to," he said. "An ugly rat dropped your bottles and I stopped him, but he got away." Wilma picked him up in her arms and hugged him. "Wilma, you aren't mad at me?" he asked. Wilma glanced at him. "I was, but not anymore." "But you're Carl," Wilma interrupted. "I can make more." "I'm glad you guarded my things." Carl smiled big. He was glad to be Wilma's cat. The end. Fireflies in the Night, a Wilma and Carl story, written by Havila McLatt, illustrated by Rocco DeCaro. One evening, Wilma and Carl arrived back home after shopping in the village. At that moment, a loud burst of thunder startled them. They looked up and the whole sky was covered in darkness and lightning appeared before their eyes. Quickly, they rushed inside and Wilma shut the door. "Whew," she said in a huge sigh of relief. Carl jumped on a chair by the window and gazed outside it. His hair spurred up after another lightning strike and rain poured heavily from the sky. "Geez, someone is sure dumping a bucket of water today," Carl said, stepping away from the window. Wilma put her broom away and carried her bag. Before leaving the room, she patted Carl's head. "Now you don't have to worry. I'm sure this storm will pass before we know it." Wilma was right. The storm ended and she opened the window to let cool breeze in. For the last few days, the weather had been sultry. The heavy rain brought coolness. Carl was about to curl himself up when something appeared in front of him. He held still as it landed right on his nose. It wasn't any smaller than the size of a sunflower seed. Shaking his head, the little fly didn't move. "Can't you see I'm trying to get some sleep?" Carl said to the fly. Wilma was in the other room, so she wasn't there to see him and the fly. Carl sighed, and suddenly, the fly lit up with glowing light. His eyes widened. The glowing fly took off and flew through the window to the forest. Carl hurried after it and jumped out of the window to follow it. Suddenly, Carl stopped in awe as he was surrounded by twinkling lights and his friend came back to him. Meanwhile, Wilma brought Carl's dinner to the room. She looked around and he was nowhere to be seen. "Carl, I don't have time to play hide and seek," she said in a serious tone. "Come out wherever you are." Wilma gasped and realized Carl must have snuck out through the open window. She ran outside to search for him. "Where could he be?" Wilma wondered, glancing around the forest. She couldn't see much in the dark except for a bunch of bright green lights twinkling around the forest. Pulling out her wand, Wilma magically transformed it into a flashlight. "Carl, I can't believe you wandered off." She stopped as she noticed something moving by the bushes. She couldn't tell if it was Carl and took a closer look. At the same time, she heard a familiar voice talking. "Carl?" she said. "Wilma?" the voice said. Wilma lowered her flashlight. She saw glowing eyes. It was Carl! Nobody had glowing eyes as big as his. Carl jumped into Wilma's arms. "I was so worried," she said with a sigh of relief. Carl looked up at her. "I was strongly captivated by glowing flies." "Ah, you were in awe by the fireflies," Wilma said, smiling. Carl nodded upon learning the real name of the glowing flies. As they turned back to head home, the fireflies twinkled and lit a path leading them there. The end. A Christmas Exchange, a Wilma and Carl story, written by Havila McLatt, illustrated by Rocco DeCaro. One evening, Wilma and Carl returned home from visiting their friends in town for Thanksgiving dinner. Wilma's face lit up when she saw a couple of envelopes on the floor and picked them up to peer through. She tossed the others in the trash and opened the one big letter. "Don't you think that mail is important too?" said Carl, peeking in the trash can. "Nah, they are junk. But this one isn't," said Wilma, showing him the envelope. "This is from my family." She unfolded the letter and read it out loud. "Dear Wilma, we hope you had a lovely Thanksgiving. We missed you very much, and we are coming over for Christmas. Your uncles, aunts, and the rest of the children are planning to come too. We'll all see you Christmas Eve. Love, Mother and Father." She paused and looked down at Carl. "Carl, this means we are hosting the entire family," she told him with a big smile. Carl shook his head, lifting his tail up. "You mean their wild children are coming here?" "Why the sudden shock?" Wilma asked him with concern. Carl chuckled nervously. "They play with me like I'm a toy." He raised his tone. "I'm not a toy!" Wilma laid her hand over her mouth and remembered the story. The kids played with him when they came over to their Christmas last year. Because of that, Carl hides somewhere whenever those kids come around. Don't worry, my little kitty companion, Wilma said, smiling. She scooped him up into her arms. I promise they won't do that to you. Hearing that, Carl grinned slightly. So this means you are going Christmas shopping? Actually, we are doing a gift exchange, Wilma said, showing him the tiny paper. This year, I got Mom. Later that evening, Carl watched Wilma scribbling on a long sheet of paper. He hopped onto the table, and she looked at him. How are you going to find these things? He asked when he looked at her long gifts list. Wilma laughed and patted his head. These are ideas, and I have plenty of time to get something. As weeks went by and it grew closer to Christmas Eve, Wilma decorated the house and the Christmas tree, baked delicious cookies, and did other fun holiday activities. Carl jumped on the chair and gazed outside the window to keep his eyes out for the children. Carl, Wilma said, stepping out from the other room with a tiny gift box. I spoke with my aunts to tell their kids you aren't a toy. I appreciate that, but I won't let them touch me, Carl said, turning around and seeing she had a box in her hands. Wilma, is that a gift for your mom? When he said that, Wilma dropped the box and the cookies she baked spilled out. She covered her face with her hands and gasped with wide eyes. Ah! I can't believe I forgot about that, she said. Wilma pulled out her wand. I can whip something up with this! Carl jumped off the chair and walked up to her and the cookies. He raised his one brow and gave her a look. He's always skeptical about Wilma using magic. Why can't you do something without magic? He asked while munching on a cookie. Wilma quickly picked up the cookies and set them on the table. Then she shook her head with tears and ran to her room. Carl hurried after her. Wilma sat at the desk with her arms folded. She bowed her head and cried. Carl never saw Wilma cry. She hardly wept, but this time she was really upset. He jumped onto the desk and reached out his paw and touched her head. Wilma, it's okay. I'm sure we will figure something out. Wilma sniffed her nose and looked up. I know. I could use the wand, she said, letting out a sigh. Then she glanced at the small picture frame next to Carl. And then she turned to Carl. He was sitting upon her books. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind. Carl, you are brilliant, she said, beaming. Carl looked at her confusingly. I am? What did I do? Wilma didn't reply at that moment. Instead, she grabbed her craft box and began the project. On Christmas Eve, Wilma's family came over. For the rest of the evening, they ate dinner, played games, and chatted in the living room. Carl found his haven on the tall shelf and looked down at Wilma's cousins. Children, leave poor Carl alone, said one of the aunts. You know what? Let's open gifts, said Wilma's dad, raising his voice. But just one gift, though. We want to save some for Christmas Day. The children ran to the Christmas tree and picked one gift. As they were opening their gifts, Wilma brought her gift to her mom. Dear, she said sweetly, you don't have to give me your gift now. I can wait. Mother, Wilma said, I want to. Her mother unwrapped the gift. Her face lit up. Mother, this is a memory book, Wilma said. I made it myself. She took out the book, and when she looked inside, she gasped softly. Inside the book, Wilma added pictures of when she had her first lesson flying on a broom with her mom by her side, and a picture of when she was a baby being held in her mom's arms. Her mom looked up at Wilma. She swelled in tears. You made this? Wilma nodded and asked, Do you like it? Wilma's mom lowered the book and threw her arms around Wilma. She hugged and kissed her on her forehead. This is the most precious gift I have ever received. Thank you, dear. Those words warmed Wilma's heart. She smiled and embraced back. Carl was right. She didn't need to use her wand. Even if it wasn't whipped up by magic, her mom loved it because she made it with love. That was enough. The end. And Merry Christmas. Mushroom Hunt. A Wilma and Carl story, written by Havilah McLatt, illustrated by Rocco DeCaro. One beautiful autumn afternoon, Wilma vacuumed the floor of her living room, and Carl jumped on the chair near the window to look at Wilma. He grew curious. She had been cleaning as if they were expecting company. I hope it isn't her crazy cousins. I already had enough torture with them, Carl thought. Wilma's aunt and uncle brought them over to visit recently, and the girls dressed him up for their tea party. When Wilma finished cleaning, he asked, "Who is coming? Please don't tell me the kids are coming back." Wilma shook her head, chuckling. "No, my friend Jennifer is coming to visit again." Carl sighed in relief. "Oh, that makes sense. I suppose having the little ones here isn't a good idea. You would have to clean up their mess." Wilma looked at him. "They can be a handful, but they are family. Plus, I want Jennifer to feel welcome." The doorbell rang moments later, and Wilma opened the door. Her friend Jennifer, in her tall pink hat with a bright moon crest and matching dress, stood there with a little corgi next to her. The dog looked up at Wilma. Wilma beamed. "Jennifer, you got a doggie!" A big, cheerful smile spread across Jennifer's face, and she picked up her dog in her arms. "Wilma, I would like you to meet my loyal companion, Tia." Tia barked excitedly. Wilma picked up Carl from the chair and smiled. "Tia, this is Carl." Carl stared at the dog with big ears. Tia touched Carl's nose and sniffed him. "I'd rather you didn't sniff my fur," Carl said. Tia jerked back and whimpered. "It's okay, girl. You don't need to be scared," Jennifer said. "Carl is a friendly cat." "I hope it won't be a problem," Wilma said worriedly. Wilma's friend stroked Tia's head and said, "She will be fine." And she was right. Tia eventually accepted that Carl wasn't an ordinary cat after Jennifer told her about the incident with the potion. That evening, Tia played with him. She would drop her yellow ball in front of him, and he swung his paw. The ball rolled across the floor, and she raced after it. "Jennifer, you remember that mushroom with potatoes and chives?" Wilma asked. "Your mom would make them quite often this time of year." Jennifer stood up from sitting on the couch and said, "I do. It's a mushroom potato soup." "We could make that for supper," Wilma said. "We have all the ingredients, but we need to go out and get mushrooms." "Okay," Jennifer said excitingly. On the way out, Jennifer called out to Tia, and she wagged her tail excitedly. "Do you want to join us?" Wilma asked Carl. Carl hopped on the couch, stretched his body, and shook his head. "Nah, you go. I'll stay here and get some sleep." The two friends strolled into the forest, and off they went to hunt for the mushrooms. After searching in one spot, they drifted from the path to observe another part of the forest. A few minutes later, Tia barked, and Jennifer saw that she had found some mushrooms. "Are they safe to eat?" Wilma asked. "Some of the mushrooms here might be poisonous." Jennifer picked one and observed it closely to see if it had white gills, red caps, or stems. "Yes," Jennifer replied as she showed the mushroom to Wilma. "I've trained Tia to track the scent of any plant, person, or animal." Wilma's face lit up in amazement. "Really?" she asked. "That's good to know." Soon they plucked quite a few mushrooms out, and then Wilma said, "I think we've got plenty. Let's head back." The sky darkened and the stars appeared in the bleak orb, but the girls hadn't found the path back to Wilma's house. Jennifer took out her wand and turned it into a flashlight. Then she asked, "Are we lost?" "I'm not sure," said Wilma. Though she had gone down many different trails before, this trail she wasn't familiar with. "I think we may have gone too far." Suddenly, Wilma remembered what Jennifer told her earlier. "Didn't you say Tia could track the scent of any animal?" "Tia could lead us to the house, but we need something for her to smell." Wilma looked at her dress while Jennifer raised her flashlight higher, and she found some of Carl's fur stuck on the cloth. "Will this work?" she asked as she held out her hand towards Tia. The dog sniffed the fur, and then she ran. The girls hurried after her until they had found the house. Carl woke up from a long, restful sleep as he heard the door creak open and footsteps entered the building. He saw that Wilma, Jennifer, and Tia the dog had returned from the forest, and they'd brought back a basket full of mushrooms. Looking out the window across from the bed, he noticed it was nighttime. "What happened?" he asked. "We got lost," Jennifer replied as she waved her wand and magically a treat appeared in her hand. She gave it to Tia and she munched it in satisfaction. "We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Tia. What could she possibly do?" Carl asked. "Dogs don't have the ability to see in the dark like cats do." "You are certainly right," said Wilma as she began to prepare dinner. "However, they can track down animals by their scent." Tia rested on the floor and Carl jumped on the chair to watch them cook. "Oh," he said, "and Tia could track your scent because your fur was stuck on Wilma's dress," Jennifer said with a smile. "I'm glad my fur brought you back. I'm famished," Carl exclaimed. Soon enough, all four ate the mushroom soup and a fresh loaf of bread. They all thought the soup was so good, they ate until the pot was completely empty. After an hour ticked by, Jennifer grabbed her broom and gave Wilma a goodbye hug. "We'll see each other again soon," Jennifer said with tears in her eyes. Tia hopped on right behind Jennifer, and off they dashed into the starlit night. The